Did
Yeah.
you say that capitalism is even more unequal than the feudal system?
Yes. 1 billion people on this planet are more immiserated than the peasants of the Middle Ages. There are people who are vastly more rich than the feudal kings and queens. When you're scared for your life, you go to a doctor, and your doctor is a scientist. We all believe in science when we're scared for our life. Bad things will happen, defeats will happen. But remember the American Revolution: lose, 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 win. How did that happen?
Welcome to Mind, Body, Health, and Politics. I'm your host, Dr. Richard Lewis Miller. The mission of Mind, Body, Health, and Politics is to enhance your physical and emotional well-being and encourage community. I say encourage community because I believe that human beings are basically tribal animals, and we do the best to sustain ourselves and maintain our health when we live in small tribes where we know each other, if not by name, then by face. Today on Mind, Body, Health, and Politics, I have the privilege of being with us Kim Stanley Robinson, arguably our country's greatest science fiction writer, who many of you know writes about things that are far and away beyond science fiction. Welcome to Mind, Body, Health, and Politics, Stan. What's on your radar screen today in November of 2024?
Well, like a lot of people, I am dismayed at the results of the recent national election. And so I'm struggling to cope with that and understand that and figure out how to go forward in a positive way, which isn't easy. I've been losing some sleep pondering that as basically a science fiction writer who has become a public intellectual devoted to talking about climate change and what we can do about it. It seems to me that this is an issue that I can't dodge, that the federal government the executive branch will be run by climate deniers, and maybe the legislative branch, and maybe the judicial branch. Climate denialism is a denial of reality. And, because of your roots in psychology and psychiatry, denial of reality is a kind of a repression. And there's always the return of the repressed, often in twisted and dark forms. So more specifically, I'm focusing in on the local. I'm part of a little movement here in Davis, California, a group called Cool Davis. And I think there are little groups like this all over the world, tribes like you described, where the global problem of climate change is being taken on at the local level of what you can do with your own hands, with people you know. That's profoundly comforting to me. And then also I've been doing things on the international level. And since it's a global problem, the UN is an obvious platform and discussion space and actor in the world. I'm very pleased to be associated with and working with the UN in various offices there, that including the recent Summit of the Future and this thing they published in September during Climate Week called Pact for the Future, essentially trying to take the future generation into account, generations, these people over the time horizon who will come someday as citizens, even now, that we need to take account of. This is a really interesting movement to me. And then I've also been looking into what gets casually and usually negatively called geoengineering. I've been wondering if the planet heats up so much that millions die from it, if we might not want to be cooling the planet down for a few decades, if we can, to try to cope with the underlying problem of too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So these are my current concerns.
When I think Kim Stanley Robinson, the topics that come to mind that I associate with you are climate, of course, capitalism, and utopia. Those are the three things that I associate with you. And how does the climate issue fit in with regard to level of importance as related to the other two, namely capitalism and utopianism?
Well, thank you for that formulation. I like that. These are indeed the three large braided themes in my work over the last 40 years. So I appreciate that very much. And I would say, let me try to describe the braiding in this way. Capitalism is a relationship to reality that doesn't take into account the biospheric costs and damages of our actions in the world. So it's a false accounting system. So capitalism has a problem of inequality where the few take the value of the work of the many. This is a straightforward definition, and capitalism itself, in its theorists, would not deny that. It's a residue of the feudal system where there were kings and a few aristocrats and some squires operating the system, some soldiers enforcing the system, and then a whole bunch of poor peasants working to support their superiors in the social order. It's not very different in capitalism. It's a little more liquid. It's a little more unequal than the feudal era, shocking though it may seem, but it's true numerically. So I don't like
Excuse me 1 second, Stan. Did
yeah.
you say that capitalism is even more unequal than the feudal system?
Yes. If you look at the bottom level of sheer immiseration, there were 1 billion people on this planet who are poorer and more immiserated than the peasants of the Middle Ages. And then at the same time, at the other end of the scale, there are people who are vastly more rich than the feudal kings and queens. So inequality is worse under capitalism. It is true that individuals within the system can perhaps rise or fall within it by their own efforts and by luck. It's a little bit more fluid of a situation than the locked in, you do what you were born to do feudal order. But in any case, capitalism came out of feudalism. It represents a social discrepancy and an inequality that's still there. But worst is that it wrecks the biosphere for short-term profit rather than for long-term sustainability. And the costs of that damage are called externalities, negative externalities, and they're not incorporated in the costs that we charge ourselves to pay for our activities. So the biosphere is getting wrecked. So capitalism, the two main flaws are we're wrecking the biosphere without regard for the fact that it is in fact our support system, our extended body, and our one and only home. So wrecking it so that a few people become ultra rich beyond any need is a foolish system. I've been an anti-capitalist my whole career. And then utopia would be the statement that we could do better. And there are some obvious ways to quickly make things better that could be legislated and could become law as well as norms of behavior. But for sure, the political economy, which is the combination of economic laws and what you might call the rest of the legal system and how we operate with each other, both in business and in civil society, these rules change all the time, and they're obviously not very good right now and need to be improved. Any description of that improvement, any imagination of that improved or better society, even if it's only one step along the way, that's utopian thinking. It has to do with imagining a better world and also how do we get there? Which I would say the last part is a little bit of a tack on of the last few decades or the last century. In other words, utopia used to be a vision of a better society already achieved, like in Sir Thomas More's Utopia and many following example in the literature. And then with H.G. Wells and with Ursula K. Le Guin, you began to get utopia as process, as you have more exciting plots because the plot describes the process of getting to utopia or protecting it from destruction once you get to a better society, as in the work of Ian Banks. So the utopian tradition, as it got more novelistic and more involved with process and with history, it became bigger than it was with Sir Thomas More, and became utopia as a name for thinking about positive futures that we could enact. And I'm
What
very interested in that.
is utopianism in part an antidote to capitalism?
Oh, definitely. If you say that history is a story of changing political economies, then you have the ancient command and control systems of the great empires of early humanity right after the agricultural revolution. Those eventually became feudalism. And then in the 16th and 17th century, the 18th century, they all this changed into capitalism. There's going to be another system. So, what is it going to be? And if it's going to become better, what would characterize, how could we make it better? And how would you describe it? So, utopian science fiction, you take a story set in the future where the society is better. How did we get to it? How does it maintain itself? How does it defend itself? These are the plots of utopian science fiction.
How would you describe the government of Genghis Khan?
Genghis Khan was the ancient command control system, kind of on the border between what Babylon and the pharaohs of Egypt, Mesopotamia. All of these systems, and India, ancient India, had the priest caste, the leaders, the kings, who were often regarded as gods, the warriors, the artisans, and the farmers. And this basic split into 4 or 5 classes was actually widespread across the earth, even though these communities were not in obvious communication with each other. It seemed like I won't call it natural, but an easy division to make once you get settled agricultural communities and then urban centers. The first power systems resembled that. Now, Genghis Khan began to become an imperial person. He decided to conquer Asia. And so he was really more of a Mongolian tribes person in a pastoral society that wasn't even agricultural. And so what he realized is, with his military technology, which is to say horses, bows and arrows, and communication systems amongst his units that were extremely rapid for the time, using effectively waving flags and sight across huge distances and the like, that he could conquer any force that he came upon with that military technology being simply better than anybody else's. So Genghis Khan is interesting in that he was not agricultural. He was an earlier pastoral, and the combination of the horse weaponry and the idea, let's conquer the world, let's make other people work for us. And that, when you look at Genghis Khan, when you look at Alexander the Great, this urge to conquer the world is actually quite bizarre. It has no utility value. It's an idea that and a project that can drive the lives and can cause millions of deaths. It can change history, et cetera, et cetera. But as an idea itself, it's a sort of a pathological. In Alexander, it's completely clear. In Genghis Khan, a little less clear. That
Yes,
it's a psychosis.
In Khan, though, some people see the antecedents of socialism.
Well, that is a good point, because I think with Genghis Khan, you have that earlier pastoral tribalism. You don't have the hierarchy of the agricultural kingdoms. He is a looser Central Asian. He's a throwback to an earlier age that discovered that they actually had the skills to conquer a historically later civilization. So socialism is an interesting word that needs its historical basis, but I know what you mean. There was a kind of in fact, Marx talked about primitive communism, where people were all in the society together and somebody was a kind of a loose leader, but everything else was somewhat shared by the whole society. There wasn't an emphasis on private property, etc. So yes, I can see why people would say that about Genghis Khan. and his society.
So, as a response to capitalism, why isn't Marxism working? Why is Marxism turning into basically gangsterism, as we see in Russia, for example, who hide under the flag of communism, perhaps?
Well, they did. And that's a good question, Richard. And I guess I would say when you are in a hurry such that you decide that you need to use violence, that you're going to have a violent revolution in order to get to the next social system, and this happens a lot, the violence leads to more violence, it leads to suffering and resistance, and then the most violent people win and take over, so that if the revolution had certain goals, like the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, and then they impose that violently, and you might argue that that would be necessary or nothing would ever happen at all. But in any case, the most violent members of the revolutionary group then take over, and very quickly you suddenly have Napoleon and an imperial system. And so in Russia, it was Lenin who decided that Marxism needed to succeed in Tsarist Russia as fast as possible. There were other Marxist movements around the industrialized European countries that were trying to work by way of social action, by way of elections, by way of organizing into unions and pressure groups, and also co-ops where they simply started up socialist little cooperatives from scratch, the so-called Soviets, when the Russian name was put onto them. And there were attempts at, you might say, gradualist, the long revolution, as Raymond William called it, the long march through the institutions that would lead to a socialist result. But Lenin saw the opportunity in when Russia was losing World War I, the czars were losing World War I to the Germans. When that whole society collapsed, you could quickly institute a Marxist society as Lenin conceived of it. So you began to drift away from Marx's ideas, which were in any case more analytical than predictive. So a lot of what Marx did was simply an analysis of capitalism. And when he talked about what would come next, he was in some areas quite vague and was willing to let later history develop and invent what would be what I like to call post-capitalism. So what is post-capitalism? If it becomes Leninist and then Stalinist Soviet Union, well, you have exactly the gangsterism, the takeover of the state by a small group that then gathers all power to itself. There is no civil society. There is no polyarchy. There is no distribution of power down to lower levels, really. And this command from above mentality in a government, it seems to me, is always leads to bad results. That it's better to have power distributed out through lots of groups in a way that we sometimes call civil society, and that a true socialism would be, in fact, distributed power, right down to full-on democracy, in that every citizen has an equal amount of power. This is sometimes called anarchy, but other times it's called a true socialism. The names are fuzzy, and maybe this is getting a little bit too theoretical.
So, do we have examples that you can point to, even small ones, that speak for from each according to his ability, to each according to their need?
Yes. And I have brought them up before, and readers of my work will not be surprised because since there aren't very many living examples of this, they keep coming up in my work because I don't know of any others that are better.
One is the Mondragon an example?
Yes, Mondragon is an example. Now, Mondragon exists in a capitalist world, and it is a business, a town of interlocked businesses that are all the businesses, including the banks, are owned by the townspeople. So it's a cooperative. And you might say that this is a kind of a um, liberation theology. This is a kind of a Catholic workers' socialist system or cooperative, Mondragon. And so it's very specific to its town, but its lessons can be learned and spread anywhere. The workers own their businesses, the profits that are made by that business in a larger capitalist world, and they are the 10th biggest company in Spain when rated that way. The profits are divided equally between the owners, 1/3, that is to say the workers, then 1/3 to capital improvements for the businesses they're running, and then 1/3 to charities that they choose. So this is a working model of an alternative to capitalism that I think has been altered by a kind of I mean, the Catholic Church is a mixed bag with an awful lot of bad things that it's done, but it's one Catholic priest who helped the locals in that area to invent what you might call a compassionate capitalism or a cooperative system of employee ownership. My other example that I often use is the Indian state of Kerala, down in the
Yes.
Southwest. And
Yes.
Kerala has an intense polyarchy where the local councils, the panchayats, are first of all intended to be gender balanced, and then secondly, alternate at the state level between a local communist government and the Congress Party that India had from 1947 on. And they alternate on a regular basis, no matter without elections, but just with an agreed arrangement to go 4 years for one and then 4 years of the other. And then there are something like 13,000 local councils in what is actually rather a small patch of land. And it means that almost every citizen is involved in governance. And the results are a much more prosperous and balanced and socially equal in terms of Gini figures and the like society than in most places on Earth. So I don't know if these places serve as examples. They have their individualities and their own geographical and historical and cultural specificities. I just point to them to show that societies like this can exist and can work very well, and that people have more life satisfaction living in systems like that.
Here in the United States, it's said that somewhere between 60 and 75% of the country are living paycheck to paycheck. Now,
Yes.
you've read that, of course, and you're talking about capitalism being the descendant of feudalism, which it is. And it was very hard to get the feudal leaders to give up their power. And perhaps the American Revolution was the modern example of moving in a different direction. But given where we are now, Stan, and given the enormous amount of wealth that the few have aggregated, and given that we have this 70% who are living paycheck to paycheck, what are some of your ideas if you had a magic wand for where we go next?
Well, that's a great question. And I will put out a few ideas.
Thank you.
Let us make the assumption that the democratic system that we live in, or the Republican system we live in, the system of representation, where we elect representatives who then go and together craft laws that rule us, that system would have to become real by the elections being won by people who are actually representing their constituents fairly and honestly. Legislators that get bought away by the rich and serve the purposes of the rich rather than the purposes of their constituent. That's one obvious problem with American democracy. People with more money simply have more speech, and they manage to influence the discourse. But the discourse is open to all. If we were to talk it over, if the story was spread we control the government with our votes. And if we had the right representatives, they would pass laws that are in favor of us. We would be testing the proposition that democracy might really be real. And even though it looks like it's bought by the rich, and these days is kind of a false front over an oligarchy of rich with a facade of democracy that is actually somewhat meaningless, if that facade suddenly became a little more steely and a little more real, in other words, electing representatives who held to the values that they said they would hold to when they ran for office. And House of Representatives, you can make that judgment every 2 years. And at the other levels, 4 years, 6 years. It's a graduated system, but you could keep throwing politicians out till you got ones who would actually represent you. That requires a story being told that I guess we're not hearing now. But if that were to happen, then what you would want is progressive taxation. You go back to essentially the New Deal and to the taxation that existed as a starting point during Eisenhower's administration in the early 50s, where when you made whatever you made more than $400,000 a year was taxed at a 93% rate. So progressive taxation, where the more you make, the more you pay in taxes, is a very powerful equalizer. And if you regard the government as the company that is owned of the people, by the people, and for the people, then a lot of the profit that's being made would come back to the government that sets the conditions for that profit to exist in the first place.
I have one problem with that, Stan.
Yeah.
It sounds good with a big but. And the big but is, as you point out, those who have more money have more say. And why would those with more say ever allow such a change as to increase their taxes and spread the wealth? That group never wants to give up power throughout all of history.
That's quite true. But then, is democracy real or not? American democracy, let's focus in on our own country. In other words, if the American population elected a House of Representatives and a Senate and a president that passed laws that made progressive taxation come back again, then the rich could do nothing about it. The laws would apply to them. So you have to postulate a situation, which I think exists now, where you have to buy off these legislatures to serve some people other than their constituents, which is to say the rich.
You know why I'm laughing? Because I agree with you. You have to buy them off because they're being bought off. But the people who have the money have the big amount to bribe them with. And the rest of the 70% who are living to paycheck, they sure as hell aren't going to buy them off. Now,
no.
Right? Now, I'm going to bring something else into this discussion. 20% of the United States, roughly, I'm going by numbers I'm given, of course, are illiterate. 50% of the United States live somewhere around the 5th grade level of reading. These people do not understand what people like you and me. Look behind you. What do I see on your screen? Books. Look behind me. What do I see behind me? Books. I'm talking 50% of the United States couldn't read any of the books behind you or behind me. And these are the people who are doing the voting, as well as the other half, of course.
Yeah.
Now, this is an issue that did not get mentioned anywhere during this recent election, and I can't remember a time when this issue was discussed at an election. Namely, how do you reach the people who cannot read and write? And who is reaching them, and how are they reaching them?
Yeah, well, it's a great point. And I want to say immediately that oral culture is older and more basic than written culture. It's word of mouth, and it's the radio, and it's smartphones. And although the 60 or 70% are living paycheck to paycheck, A bit of the money that they have that's discretionary goes to a communication system, a TV, a smartphone. And I'm going to say that no matter what one's level of literacy or education, there's a sense now in which everybody knows everything because people are smart. They may be poorly educated, they're still smart. The human brain and our ability to comprehend concepts is, as long as you've got language, as long as you can talk, you can think, and you can understand. So it's interesting that you bring this up because it immediately makes me think talk radio is mostly right-wing propaganda, and it's working very well. People who do get most of their information by word of mouth rather than by reading are being told a bunch of lies by right-wing talk radio that is filled with anger, resentment, and disgust and scorn for the other, contempt and hatred. So with that spilling into your ear and you're not much of a reader, you do get people living paycheck to paycheck who are voting precisely against their own material interests.
Yes.
And that is, of course, scary. And the antidote to it is really to get on the airwaves and to tell a more convincing story, point out aspects of necessary solidarity amongst people, point out that we are altruistic, that we, in our very natures, want to help because we are, as you pointed out, tribal creatures. We are social creatures. We're social primates, and we need the other. We rely on them. There's no such thing as self-sufficiency. We're like bees in a beehive. So the bee is an individual for sure. And it has its own individual thoughts, its own individual life, but it cannot live without the hive, without the other bees in a social arrangement. So,
Interesting. Sorry.
Yeah, but this is the story we have to tell. This is a story not being told. And in the war of ideas, because there is a war of ideas, a discursive battle, discourse, ideology, in that war, you have to go to the oral level. You can't do it just in books.
Well, I so much agree with you, and I'll tell you a personal story related to that, Stan. I've been doing this program, Mind, Body, Health, and Politics, because I believe in what you say about the oral tradition and getting the word out. So I've been doing this now for 20 years.
Wow.
And I've got a modest a listenership. But about 4 or 5 months ago, I ran into this young man who's a graduate student. He's the son of some friends of ours, and he posts things on social media. And so I got the idea to give a try to social media, which I had not had anything to do with. So I said, I'd like to post some things and you know how to do it. So let's team up here. And he said, fine. And he said, but one thing, Dr. Miller, he said, you can't do this hour-long interview and these half-hour and 2-hour and these kind of things that you do. I said, what do I do? He said, 90 seconds. He says, you've got to do 90-second lectures.
Wow.
I said, wow, 90. Okay, I'll give it a try. So I did a half a dozen 90-second lectures on video. They went viral.
Wow.
I in no time flat, literally just the last few months, I've got 11 million viewers and 150,000 what's called followers. Although when I went out into the desert near Wilbur, they didn't follow me into the desert. I told them there'd be some water that would open up. They didn't believe me. No, just kidding. But 150,000. And so what I'm saying to you here, Stan, is attention span, according to these metrics and these social media platforms, is 90 seconds or less, and yet you can get information out. And so that's where I'm working nowadays. And I'm trying to hook up with other what are called influencers who are interested in such things as climate, ecology, utopia, interests of mine as well. Of course, my number one is health and public health. And so that's where I'm working.
Wow.
How is Kim Stanley Robinson going to get 90-second blurbs out?
Yeah, that would be very hard. That would be a test of the emergency broadcasting system for sure. I'm interested. I like compression. I like going fast. One of the things about my what is becoming my most famous book by far, especially in this century, is The Ministry for the Future.
Yes.
It's 106 very short chapters, and they combine together. And I do think that these 90-second things that you're talking about, the kind of TikTok span of attention, you do want to kind of line up sequences of them to get to larger points. And yet, I think it's very interesting. What you're talking about is almost a form of poetry. You want to condense an idea down to something that is almost like the verbal equivalent of a haiku. 90 seconds is a little longer than a haiku, but not much. And so you would have to get into compression, which can often add strength, like a spring being pressed in. And then when it gets into the mind, it springs out and becomes something larger than those 90 seconds as you consider the implications. So I love it. And I'm glad you're doing it. And congrats on that. I myself have a zero social media presence and have been relying on lectures as my oral culture contribution to the scene. And also, I'm a novelist. And so I want to talk a little bit about that, because obviously that's the opposite. A reader has to decide, I'm going to give 30 hours of my life, maybe 2 weeks of my mental recreational time to this one piece. Why? Well, because as a reader, you are co-creating that work. That work of art expands in your head because of your own efforts, your own creativity. It's not just the writer doing it. It's not like going to the movies and having images slap you in the face and you passively watch them. It's co-creation of a line of sentences into a world of experiences that are fictional but real. And what I've seen with my own eyes and in conversation all around the world now, 4 years of it in a row, is that the people who read novels feel that they own them, that they live them, that they are part of the creative process. They're not just passive consumers, but they are co-creators. So the novel has that power, which is quite powerful, because if you finish a novel, you think, oh my gosh, I've been a little girl in Naples. I've grown up in the post-war period as a girl with a best friend in Naples. This is my brilliant friend. I've lived that life. I've had that experience. Well, it's because I read a very good novel about it. And so novel readers get to have 10,000 lives within this one biological span. And that's the value of the long form.
Thank you for that. That was really fun to listen to. What about Kim Stanley Robinson going into politics? Have you ever considered that? And how? Of course you have.
Well, I've been asked. I think I would be too nerve-wracked. I'm impressed by the politicians that I see who are mainly in it for public service, and they can stay calm and they can stay friendly with all kinds of different people, and they can get things done, and they are realists. I'm thinking of a neighbor of yours and someone everybody will know, Governor Jerry Brown.
Yes,
someone like that.
He's a friend of mine, and I know he was at the meeting that when I first met you at Wilbur.
Yes, and I would take it down to a smaller level, because that's what I know best. Doing local government, it's a pain in the ass, and the rewards are minor, and you don't make much money, and lobbyists are not trying to corrupt you. They're just citizens yelling at you, and you're trying to do something for the good of the public because you feel like it's interesting to you. I think that people are very interested in their local political jobs, but also it's a public service. So I personally am on the board of directors for my little Village Homes, a neighborhood that is a cooperative. So
in Davis, California, the Village Homes.
Yes, that's right.
Yes.
So Village Homes is a kind of 1970s hippie experiment as to how to be adults, grow up, have kids, and live a normal life after the excitement of the 60s. I know that Wilbur was a similar kind of an evolution of ideas from the 60s as to how to live, how to sustain over a full life. Well,
Yes.
Village Homes was that, and a much more suburban and kind of Central Valley of California is like being in the Midwest. It's intensely boring landscape, and people have each other, but they don't have much outside of that except for industrial agriculture, which is a sad, sorry sight. But Village Homes has governance. It's just 220 homes, but we are a little nation state of 85 acres and about maybe 800 people. It's hard. We don't even have a census count, but I can guess it's about 800 people. We govern ourselves, and it's all volunteer, and it's all self-organized, except that we have a constitution, which is the CC&Rs. And we're trying to revise it. It's as hard as revising any other constitution. But we're trying, because we have a constitution from 1975 that is a little ramshackle in the current legal world. So I've had my taste of governing, and I must say I love my fellow directors. I got on this board in a fit of irritation because a previous board had killed our preschool, and I loved our preschool. So I wanted a preschool back. I joined the board in a fit of irritation and righteous anger, etc., and I was losing sleep. And then I began to work with people I wouldn't have known otherwise, and it's all gotten net positive. And so I share this story to say to others, get into local governments. It's usually volunteer. There are boards that you don't have to run for office. You just volunteer and get selected, and suddenly you're helping to govern your neighborhood, your town, and you got some interactions with other people. That's exactly what you were talking about, Richard, this tribal thing, people that that you know their names, you talk to them, and you're working on a communal project that is necessarily cooperative. We're going to govern ourselves. We're going to set rules and norms, and we're going to make this thing work, and even grow some food for each other, and stage some parties for ourselves, and create a social life and a cultural life, as well as a practical political life and a business life. All these things are possible at the micro level. And maybe that's where it works best. Maybe that's where it's most satisfying. Maybe it gets distorted the bigger it gets. But you still have people like Jerry Brown who manage to stay real, even at the level of the fifth biggest economy on earth.
What I always tell Jerry is how I fell in love with him when I read this article that said that when he needed an automobile, instead of ordering the governor's limousine and motorcycles, he went to the motor pool, and whatever the car that was ready in the motor pool was, that's what he drove out with. And that really said a lot. What I remember about your village there in Davis is that the streets, instead of being straight, had curves in them.
Yes.
And I thought that was just the bee's knees. I thought that was the smartest thing I'd ever seen. And then, of course, you also collect rainwater, as I recall. Are you still doing that?
Absolutely. Thanks for that. The village was designed by Mike and Judy Corbett and their friends in the 70s to imitate a European village. So instead of the standard streets, we have curving lanes that dead end. A little of this is sometimes called retro, but I tell you, it works like a charm. Our streets we walk right down the middle of, and we don't have sidewalks. Bicycle paths alternate with car streets, and there's communal gardens. And the swale system is what you mentioned about water. When it does rain, the water pools on the land and then descends into the groundwater below us, replenishing the water table. It does not get put into a sewer system and run off out the Golden Gate into the Pacific. This has been hugely helpful. And it's too bad that it's only 85 acres. It's too bad Village Homes wasn't imitated in the real estate suburban construction eras that followed it. And I can say very simply why. The developer doesn't make as much money if you do it in Village Home style. And the laws of city building codes and street division codes, platting codes are often mean that a village like Village Homes, a design, is illegal under the law. And a sympathetic city council has to overrule their staffs, as they did in Davis, to get such a neighborhood built. And at that point, the banks don't want to lend money to something that chancy. So Village Homes has not been imitated very often. And yet it stands as an example of how even suburban life, which is remarkably alienating and stupid, I say this as a person who grew up in suburbia down in Southern California, it's not a good social arrangement, but a village is. And the differences are worth thinking about and legislating.
Have people been writing books or making documentaries about village homes?
Yes, it was intense at the beginning, so that most of the films and literature on village homes come from the 1980s. And then people in Australia and in Japan got interested, and there were village homes influenced developments built in Japan and in Australia in the 90s. And then it just kind of folded back into the neoliberal, things as they are, ordinary American suburban reality. It, it was not influential enough to change the world, but it does stand, again, like Mondragon, like Kerala, on a much smaller scale. It stands as a model of what could be done if you were to really think about design, about human social design, without using big words, without thinking capitalism or socialism, although that's always useful, but thinking about how do people grow food, get along, save water, socialize with each other? Can we design for that? And then you look at your ordinary Mediterranean village and you realize people have been designing for that for a few thousand years. And what they've come up with has lessons for us all if we care to learn them.
I met you at Wilbur Hot Springs, which, as you pointed out, I created the health sanctuary there in 1972. I did so because I'm a health advocate and I wanted a place that would be a safe place. I called it a health sanctuary, a safe place to be healthy. But it's also a place to think and share ideas, as you did when you came to Wilbur and shared some of your ideas. And I certainly hope you come back and share some ideas with me and Will and Robbie and the rest of the gang. Until that time, we have a few minutes left. I promised you we would end a bit early because you have another meeting. Um, for those who are set back on their heels by this election, tell us, tell them, what do you advise?
I want to say that this isn't an easy moment, and it's a bit shocking to realize that there are fellow citizens around the United States of America who are angry enough, resentful, and um, frightened enough to vote for an obvious demagogue that is outside of the tradition of American democracy and breaking standards that every other political leader has held to, except for some famous counterexamples like Joseph McCarthy and Huey Long and um, Charles Lindbergh, etc. So I wouldn't want to sugarcoat it. It's a bad moment, but there is a network of institutions in the United States that sometimes gets called civil society. And then there's also town government and the ability to interact with your neighbors. At that level, you can keep active. And you can also stay active at the national level and keep hope. The next 2 years will be chaos and disorder, and a lot of ugly things will happen. There's no doubting it because the plan has been published in advance. But the support for it will quickly go away when the chaos ensues and when people lose their insurance and their Social Security and their Medicare. As that begins to get chipped away at by this very same government that promised to be such a model of excellence, disenchantment will weigh in. And if the usual political sequence that has historically been proven happens, then in 2 years, there's a chance to take back the House of Representatives, if it indeed has been lost, and then begin to get back into the politics of compromise. And here, I mean, everything I'm saying is really, I think, almost a cliche or the obvious first things to say. But maybe I want to add that in terms of compromise, this is the discursive battle in engagement with others where you are agreeing that a middle solution that satisfies lots of people might be better than holding to your purity and not getting anything. So I want to argue against purity and righteous indignation in favor of engagement and compromise. We in getting done what can get done rather than getting nothing done because you hold for some kind of ideological or spiritual purity. Where purity doesn't exist. It's an idea and it can wreck effective politics. So get ready to talk to people and maybe extend the reach of who you talk to, either online in social media or in person at meetings. And remember that civil society includes churches and service groups and clubs and recreational groups and sports activities. These are mixed political populations where a little bit of outreach, a little bit of compromise, and a little bit of persuasion as to why the Democratic Party is worth supporting and keeping in office is a good idea. And following that line, a couple more points. It's the Democratic Party that we have to thank for Social Security, for Medicare, for 40-hour weeks, for the weekend, for a sense of dignity in the people who do live paycheck to paycheck, and a lack of sheer immiseration to the best that has been able to get enacted in law. That's a Democratic Party achievement, and people should not forget that because that's still there as an opportunity. Even if the Democratic Party lost its way during the neoliberal years, it always exists as the party of the people. And the other point I'll end with is this. Science is what's keeping us alive. And if there's any time someone expresses skepticism towards science, you should perhaps ask those skeptics, what do you do when you get sick? Or what do you do when you're injured and you go to the ER? When you're scared for your life, you go to a doctor, and your doctor is a scientist. And they exist in a matrix of science that goes from physics to chemistry to biology to the social sciences. We all believe in science when we're scared for our life. So don't be a hypocrite. Support science no matter what your politics are. And remember that when you're scared, you go to a scientist. So if a scientist says to you, we're burning down the planet and it will wreck everything, you can't toss that information aside and say, I don't care. You have to attend to it because the planet is our extended body. If the planet's sick, we're sick. And that needs to be attended to. So defend science, defend democracy, and it will be a fight and it'll be a struggle. Bad things will happen, defeats will happen. But remember the American Revolution. Lose, 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 win. How did that happen? Persistence of vision and hanging in there in the dark times. So let's do that, and on we go.